Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Let me introduce you to our guest today. Joining us is Shihoko Goto. Shihoko is Director for Geoeconomics and Indo-Pacific Enterprise, and also Deputy Director of the Wilson Center's Asia program. She's joined by Lucas Myers. Lucas is the Senior Associate for Southeast Asia for that same program, and they've co-authored a new essay titled Testing the Bond of Shared Economic Security Interests. And the countries they're talking about are the United States and Japan. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be here.
Great to be here.
So let's start with the concept of economic security and how it's different from the way we've talked and thought about security issues in the past. Shihoko, let's begin with you if we could.
Yeah, so what we're seeing is a convergence of economic concerns and national security interests. It used to be that economic policy was very siloed into the economic agencies such as Treasury, Federal Reserve, Commerce Department, and then national security issues were dealt with largely by the Pentagon. These days, though, we are seeing that national security interests are driven by issues such as technology, such as economic issues that drive the power and the influence of countries. And so we have someone like the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, talking about economic issues, and people like Janet Yellen at Treasury talking about security concerns as well. So as a result, we are seeing here in the United States this convergence of economic and security interests, so we call it economic security concerns. But of course, this is being seen in other countries as well. And we focused in this particular paper about how there are similarities between the United States and Japan and shared interests when it comes to economic security concerns.
And the paper that Shihoko just referenced and I referenced in my introduction. Tell us about that. Let's step back for a second from digging into the content and tell us about the piece that's available now at wilsoncenter.org. And I'll give you a little more information on how to find it before we wrap up this discussion.
So basically, this report is a year-long project that essentially is looking into the idea of economic security cooperation and how to enhance that between the United States and Japan. And going forward, I think the idea is that this is a changing relationship. The bilateral partnership or relationship was oftentimes grounded in a strictly defense-based alliance in the beginning, but now it's increasingly economic, as Shihoko mentioned. And I think going forward, you can see that coming out of two driving factors. You have the China angle in recent years, and then also the pandemic and the disruptions to supply chains, for instance. And so really this report's attempting to capture this moment and explore the policy implications for both the United States and Japan and look for ways that we can increase our partnership.
Expand a bit on that idea of Chinese coercion and the pandemic's impacts and what that revealed in a way that was unavoidable and that had policymakers thinking about a different approach.
Right. So we talk a lot about strategic competition between the United States and China. And that strategic competition manifests itself in a number of ways, on the economic front, of course, on the security front, but also politically and culturally as well. And for us, when we step back and look at this competition, we want to also think about, well, how do we define victory? And there is this changing idea of what this US-China competition is leading to. And what the United States and China really do want to do is, one, they do want to avoid war. But at the same time, they want to be the ones who are determining the rules of the code of conduct, the rules of engagement. We are seeing this change in the economic and political and security order in the Indo-Pacific and also in the world. How can these two countries actually compete with one another to be able to be that top dog, to be that driving force that will continue to drive the rules of engagement in the 21st century and beyond? And that's where the competition is strikingly.
And that X factor indicates that perhaps allies like the US and Japan can't be as competitive and they have to be more cooperative?
That's right. So traditionally, US-Japan economic competition was really seen in the economic front. And now we are actually seeing the two countries come together much more on the economic concerns because of this concern about a rise in China, the rise of China to dominate economic rules of engagement, and at the same time, China leveraging its economic influence today and weaponizing its ability to either take punitive action against those that it does not agree with, or rewarding countries that it wants to bring to its side. So that is the competition we are also seeing worldwide as well.
And the other factor, the pandemic, and that it revealed a lot of weaknesses around the globe.
Exactly. And you can look back, and if we all remember, during the pandemic, ports were being shut down. There was supply chain disruptions, especially, we look at even the China factors related here. In China, because of their zero COVID policy, a lot of the manufacturing hubs there had some slowdowns and disruptions, and that led to a variety of downstream effects, higher prices, inflation, a slowdown in the supply chain. And a lot of this, all these developments have really driven this rethinking, this convergence of economics and national security, that if we are going to have a secure, prosperous society, we really do need to think about economics in a more national security conversation, and they can't be hived off. And I think the other element of this is that domestic and foreign policy are interlinked. And that's I think from the U.S. side in particular, that's a driving factor.
The resilience or lack thereof of supply chains is something that's pretty easy to understand for most people because they encountered it in visceral ways in the trenches, right? Walking into the supermarket and seeing empty shelves. The objectives you list in your paper, the other is enhancing trust. I think that's the one that's a little more interesting in the sense that where is the distrust between the U.S. and Japan that needs to be addressed?
Well, I would say one of the issues is going to be how do we move forward from here? The United States and its like-minded allies and partners such as Japan, as well as Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Australia, these countries all object to China's trying to change the status quo in the economic order and the global order more broadly. They don't want to have China weaponizing its economic advantages, and so they are united in economic coercion. They want to keep away advanced technologies from China and from China abusing those technologies as well. But where do they actually want to go in the future? This is where the trust issue comes in. One of the trust issues is going to be about, well, what kind of relationship do we want with China moving forward? And the United States is talking about de-risking, not necessarily decoupling. But other countries want to move forward with a more engaged relationship with China. How do we actually move forward from here? How do we actually build trust in being able to understand a world order that is beneficial, not just to the United States, but for all the other countries as well?
And for people not familiar with the jargon, and I was one of them, de-risking. Could you give us a definition of what de-risking is?
So for a while at the beginning, there was a lot of talk about decoupling a few years ago.
Yes.
And I think that was increasingly viewed, by many in the policy community as too strong a term, because we're not going to decouple completely from the Chinese economy. Even in the most severe form of competition, this is a globalized world, we're very interdependent economically, and so really decoupling is a bit of a strong word. And so de-risking comes in. It's recently, especially you see it coming out of Europe and now increasingly the United States talking about de-risking. And the idea is that we're going to look at critical areas such as emerging technologies, supply chains of really important critical minerals. These are the areas that we want to increase our resiliency and prevent coercion from China potentially, and that would be where we're de-risking. We're reducing the risk that, say, China could coerce us.
Strategic decoupling, right? You're not decoupling in a polarized way. You're picking your spots. Right?
And I think that touches on what Shihoko was saying, is that there is sometimes there's a healthy debate between U.S. allies and partners about the extent to which, in what industries and how much we can de-risk from the Chinese economy. And I think we're going to see that moving forward. But as friends and allies, there's always going to be some friendly debate.
Well, about that, let's have both of you kind of put your heads together on coming up with the list for us and our viewers on where's the low-hanging fruit? Where will it be easy to kick off this new era of U.S.-Japan alliance and relations? And then where are the sticky wickets? Where is it going to be difficult because there is disagreement or debate?
Right. The easy one is going to be protecting advanced technology from China. So when we talk about advanced technology, we talk about semiconductors and the use of semiconductors in artificial intelligence and the like. Why do we care about that? Because that actually leads to greater control of information and social norms as well. And we don't want to give that power to China for social control, but also for use in the military-industrial complex either. So to keep that technology away from the Chinese hands is something that the United States and its key allies, the advanced economies, do agree on. So that's the low-hanging fruit. The difficulty, though, is going to be about defining the other areas. How do we define what are we going to keep away from China?
And really that's where the rubber hits the road. And that in these discussions, a short time ago, the Netherlands, Japan, and the United States came to an agreement about some of the semiconductor export controls. And that had been a bit of a debate up until that point. And the reason for that is, we do a lot of trade with China, especially in the semiconductors. And it really, the high-end stuff is where there's a lot of concern, because those are the ones that are going to be really useful from a military perspective or that social control perspective. And so drawing that line and determining, at what point can we say safely, trade these with China, or at what point do we need to say, no, let's maintain our lead and de-link this from the Chinese economy?
I'm sorry, were you going to say something? Sure.
No, I was going to also say that during the Cold War, keeping critical technology away from the Soviet Union behind the Iron Curtain, that was also something that we had to come in, we had to take into consideration. But it was pretty straightforward. There wasn't as much economic integration, so that made it easy. But also we talked about, let's keep critical technologies on the military front away from the Soviet Union. But now we talk about, well, what are the implications of these technologies in other spheres? So can we export washing machines with chip semiconductors in them? People would say no, because those chips can be replicated. But that is going to be a very difficult criterion, because we also see the emergence of non-state actors in the form of private companies. Mm-hmm. That can be a very good source of good, as well as it could have a more nefarious impact as well.
Yeah, it's not your grandmother's Cold War, right?
No.
This is different in many ways. The question of competition in an age where populist politics have been sweeping the globe, and a lot of what comes with that are protectionist impulses, mm-hmm. if not outright protectionist policies. Are there tensions between the United States and Japan in that regard?
Absolutely. We talk about political risk, and we talk about greater unity amongst like-minded countries in pushing back against Chinese coercion in particular. But we also have to bear in mind there's a great deal of uncertainty about the political future of the United States and what kind of protectionist measures a new government or a new a continued Biden administration could have. So that kind of political risk is something that all countries are looking at. What we are seeing is that there is greater protectionism. And what we are seeing also is this growth of industrial policy. An industrial policy that is about reshoring and bringing back key industries to the shores of each individual government. And
that's part of the pandemic hangover, right?
Exactly. And so where do you reconcile that? Mm-hmm. How are you going to be able to say, on the one hand, I want to make sure that my own economic competitiveness and resilience is in place, but at the same time work together with my like-minded partners to ensure that you can push back against China?
Which sounds like a very difficult balance to strike.
I think a balancing act is kind of the right frame of mind for this. I think, this is not a one-size-fits-all approach, and it's going to there's going to be iterations of discussions and strategy making between the United States and Japan going forward. And at the end of the day, there is going to be different, disagreements on occasion. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act, for instance, there was some from the automobile sector, there was some concern about that. I think overall, though, we are looking at a generally pretty strong and improving relationship on these issues. And so, I would point to that the fact that the U.S. and Japan are increasingly meeting on these things. They are coming together because I think the underlying belief is that the China coercion and the risks that we saw during the pandemic are worthy of concern, and we're going to move forward from that basis and cooperate.
What can the two countries learn from each other when they look at each other's economies?
What's interesting is that Japan actually adopted this mentality towards economic security before the United States. So Japan actually appointed an economic security minister almost 2 years ago, and it passed a legislation.
Was that a function of geography? Why were they ahead of the curve in that thinking?
Well, one of the issues was that Japan faced a great deal of economic coercion from China over a decade ago. So when Japan nationalized the Senkaku Diaoyutai Islands in 2010, and the Chinese response to that was to ban the export of rare earths. And at that time, China dominated. Over 90% of the exports of rare earths in the world came from China. And Japan needed that, and to have that ban imposed by China really hit Japan hard. So that was one of the reasons that Japan had already been thinking about its own economic security. But I should also point out that that kind of action by China is certainly not unique to Japan. South Korea had faced that. Australia more recently has faced that. Lithuania, the list goes on. So we see a lot of countries joining that bandwagon of saying they have to do something. But Japan is the first country in the world to have this economic security minister, and that has really elevated this conversation. I do think that that has helped shaped a lot of the some of the policy and the strategy that the United States is also trying.
Would that be like almost the Secretary of Defense / economy? As far
so
as how that would function within government?
It is. So it doesn't actually have a fully functioning agency per se, but it does represent a cabinet post. So you can have an individual with the ability to have the prime minister's ear to focus solely on this issue.
So in the other side of that coin, that's left to you, Lucas. So what can Japan learn from the U.S.?
So there's a few, policy areas that come to mind. One, a lot of our conversations in Japan and with, stakeholders and policymakers, it came up about Japan is currently developing security clearance policies, and that way, with a stronger security clearance system, there might be some greater room for cooperation with the United States on some of these technologies. Additionally, on the emerging technology sector, Japan's startup, culture is not quite as developed or, as the United States is, and so one of the things that came up in a few conversations was this idea that Japan could really foster some indigenous, technology development with a stronger startup culture.
So I promised you that I would tell you more about where you could read this paper. It's if you come to wilsoncenter.org and you look at the programs tab and go to the Asia program, you will be able to find it. A year in the making, as you discussed. Could you tell our viewers more about some of the other contributors and some of the other topics that are maybe a deeper dive?
Yeah, I'll start. So we have Dr. Walter Hudson, who is with the National Defense University, and he comes at it from the U.S. perspective. How does this national security and economics convergence occur? What are some of the key policy statements coming out of the United States executive branch in recent years outlining these policies, and what's the shift in thinking? And he really lays out the argument about, this landmark, change in U.S. conceptions.
And we also have a contributor from the Nakasone Peace Institute, Jun Osa, who focuses on Japan's history of economic security, really going back to the Cold War to today, and the focus on economic concerns really shaping foreign policy and now influencing security legislation in Japan as well.
And then we have additionally Yasuyuki Todo, who is a professor at Waseda University, talking about friendshoring and specifically looking at Southeast Asia, which is a key area for this, specific for a variety of demographic and economic reasons, with the idea that a resilient supply chain is going to require not just increasing domestic production, but also looking at friendshoring.
When we talk about the dawn of a new era, perhaps, or a paradigm shift, however you choose to frame it, is there a historical precedent that you could point to that this is most like?
Well, I think we are in a similar position. I don't want to overdraw comparisons because obviously the Cold War.
There are always limits, right?
Yeah, context matters, and this is a different world, as we mentioned, much more globalized. However, I think there is a similar sense of paradigm shift in thinking, especially in the United States and Japan, that we are in a long-term competition with China. Now, exactly where the boundaries are, guardrails, et cetera, that remains to be seen, but I think it's pretty clear that everybody agrees that China is a concern and we need to move forward together as an alliance to address it. And that's, I think, a similar, sense of paradigm shift. How are we going to look at this? What are the things we need to do, and what are the threats?
And another thing that we should probably be mindful of is not to oversimplify it. We can't just say this is the emergence of a new Cold War, because it isn't a bipolar conflict. It's not just about United States on the one hand and China on the other, US allies versus Chinese allies and partners. It really is also about the lifting of all boats. There is economic competition across the board, and we're seeing the influence of what we call middle powers as well, those that are not the United States or China. At the same time, there is greater recognition of the need to have the global south, the emerging markets on the side. So we see that already with China, with its Belt and Road Initiative and other approaches to cultivate support through economic tools and the like to secure that support from emerging markets. We're going to see more of that from the United States as well as from the other advanced economies to really be able to encourage the global south to see that there is this competition, to have a free and open market and established rules and stability is going to be for the benefit of the emerging markets as well. And so that will be the competition as well for hearts and minds.
As we look ahead, final question, that vision thing, right? How will we know this is working? In other words, if the pandemic was a catalyst for rethinking of what it means to have security and to combine economics and security, another pandemic could be right around the corner. How would it be different if this is working? What are the things to build resilience or whatever the case might be that we might expect from an enhanced alliance that would reap benefits down the line?
I think it goes back to what you mentioned earlier about trust. Can we establish trust to actually share information? So yes, there's going to be other disruptions, either through natural disasters or through pandemics or what have you. Are we going to be able to learn from that lesson? And one of the lessons we do need to learn from that is that we could have cooperated better. There could have been more effective ways of sharing information. There could have been ways to share resources as well. Are we going to do better next time? And that's really going to be the test of the success.
That's a terrific final word. But Lucas, if you have another to add, the pressure's on.
I mean, final words, maybe thank you to both of you. I think that was,
thank you.
Shihoko couldn't have said it better.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you very much. And again, we encourage you to read the entire paper, available at wilsoncenter.org under the Asia Program tab. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now. My thanks to Lucas Myers and Shihoko Goto for joining us. And we hope you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for your time and interest.